King Solomon says there's a time to weep, there's a time to laugh. What did he mean by that? Come join the conversation. Everything has its season, and there is a time for everything under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot the planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to wreck and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to wail and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embraces, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to rend and a time to mend, a time to be silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. Those were the first 8 verses of chapter 3 of Koheles. What do you think? Now, of course, we could analyze verse by verse, stanza by stanza, and there's lots of lessons to be gained, and we're not going to do that. But if we're looking at the overarching message of these 8 verses, what do you think is King Solomon's point? What is he trying to tell us?
Be patient. Everything will pass. Good will pass and bad will pass, and nothing is in our control. That's how
I felt that also. Be patient. I wasn't looking at it as the good, but I was looking at it as the bad. Like, be patient. There were like a few ideas I thought from these words, and one of them definitely was exactly what Vega is saying. Be patient. If right now it's not a good time, it will pass. Sometimes we're in times when have to be not good times, but they pass, and then the good time emerges. So right now it's not such a good time. Be patient. As we say in Yiddish, halt sich, hold yourself, hold yourself. It's going to be okay. This too will pass. That's an expression in Hebrew, in modern Hebrew, gamze ya'avor. This too will pass, and good times will come. So definitely that's sort of a comforting message in these words. Of course, as Vega is saying, you could look at it the flip side and say everything's going to pass. So when you're in a good time, appreciate it and understand it's not going to be forever. And when you're in a bad time, don't crumble, don't be overwhelmed, don't feel total despair. It will not be forever. Good times will emerge. Definitely a very strong message from these words. Anything else? There are definitely many other ways you could interpret this. Any other ideas?
I have another idea that we shouldn't have even, or always good is not good, or always bad is not good. So when there is a contrast, changes in life, it's a perspective. It gives us to appreciate, to react, be aware. That's what I see here, that it's all good because when things like change, it gives us like a fresh angle.
I was thinking that also. I don't think I developed the thought as much as Chava did, but I did have that nucleus of the concept, because it does say, I was basing this on another verse of King Solomon, the advantage of light that emerges from darkness. And you're like, why does light have to come from darkness? I mean, what do we need the darkness for? Let's just have light. But he's saying, like Chava is saying very eloquently, that no, actually, when the light comes from the darkness, it's a sweeter, or we might say brighter light. And it's definitely more appreciated. We appreciate the contrast. We appreciate the light from the darkness. And if, like Chava said, if we always had light and we always had light and we always had light, we might stop appreciating it. We might stop realizing that it's light. It just could become gray in our eye. But when you have those brief dark spots, what comes out is a very brilliant light, the brilliant light that shines from the darkness. So when we have short bursts of the time to weep, we really appreciate the time of joy. And that's almost like the question of what will be by Mashiach when there won't be any of the dark spots anymore. And just eternity of good. Definitely I've spoken to some people, younger people generally, who say, all good, like how boring. I'm like, trust me, I'll take it any day. But the reason why they're saying that is exactly what Chava is saying. How we're wired in this physical world is we appreciate the light from the darkness. And if we just had light day after day after day, perfect weather every single day, somewhere in California, I guess, then whatever. We don't have the appreciation for it. But by Mashiach, we will have it and we will. But now It doesn't. Anything else you see in these words?
We can also say that it's all from God and it's all good. It's supposed to be. We're supposed to have this and that. It's all our world the way the God made it.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. Which was another point I was thinking about. There's so many ideas in here, and they're all so written in these words. It just depends what you're looking at and what reflects back at you. But yeah, that's exactly what King Solomon is saying. There's a time to weep and a time to laugh, and they both come from God. A time when someone passes away, a time when someone's born. Both comes from God. Time to plant, a time to uproot. It both comes from God. It's all from God. It's all good. And maybe we can also bring in here, sometimes to us, it's very inexplicable. Sometimes to us, we don't understand how this could be from God and from good. I mean, half of the phrases we understand, but the other half seem to us like, this is God, this is good. And King Solomon is saying, it's from God. God knows everything's time. Right now, this is the time. Why? How? Why would this ever be the time for that? Well, we're not God. So for us, it doesn't make sense. For us, we don't understand why this is now the time for those things. But God says, yes, I run the world and I know, and now this is the time. Now this is the time. And it's all from me. So when you don't understand, when it seems so confusing, when it seems so dark, you can take it like Vegas said, and the dark itself as a sign that it'll be good. This is happening and that's going to happen, which is actually very living with the times. Because of course, last week was the 9th of the National Day of Tragedy of the Jewish people. And there's a famous incident recorded in the Talmud with Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages the Jews ever had, and the other sages. And when they came to the place of the temple that was very destroyed at that point, and they saw foxes cavorting, just running around where there had been the Holy of Holies, and the sages all burst into tears. And Rabbi Akiva laughed, and the sages said, Akiva, why are you laughing? And he said, why are you crying? They said, look, a fox in the Holy of Holies. And he said, that's why I'm laughing, because there's a verse that says that. And the verse continues and says, and there'll be the rebuilding. So just as this is true, this is true. And that's what Fag is saying. There's a time for this, there's a time for that. When you're in one space, no, this is true, and that's going to be true. Or as we're saying, as Chava's perspective, when you're in the darkness, say this is only to make the light sweeter. This is only to make it more appreciated. Or as Rachel is saying, this is all God, because this is from God, and this is from God. And sometimes this is the season, and sometimes this is the season. Sometimes this is the time, sometimes this is the time. Doesn't always make sense to us. God says, it's all from me. All the lights and all the darks, all the things you want and all the things you don't want, they're all coming from me. And everything has its time. Any other ideas? Anything else you see in these words?
I have one more idea.
Sure, Chava, let's hear.
So I also hear the discipline. Like, for example, Torah teaches us that we need to sit Shiva for 7 days, right? And this is time for mourning. And then, let's say, time of Sukkot is a time of joy. And, right? So it's like, instead of us, if I'm talking about things that prescribed, right? Not what something happened, but actually prescribed. Or let's say for 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av, we have to be in a state of mourning. And during Sukkot, we have to be in a state of joy, right? So there's also prescription that we need to follow and discipline instead of doing whatever I want and whenever I want.
You're saying it like the discipline, and I think that's also like a certain, well, it's a nullification, but it's also a comfort of understanding, okay, this is what God is saying is now the time. This is what God is saying we're supposed to be doing now. This is what God is saying is the right time. And it gives us, the structure gives us healing. The structure gives us strength. The structure gives us comfort. If you didn't have the 7 days of mourning, then it's just like, well, when do you mourn and how do you mourn and what's enough and what's too much and what's too little? And when God is saying, this is how you do it, it's like, okay, this is the time, and this is what I do. And this feels therefore very safe. The boundaries feel safe. The boundaries feel right. So I think, yeah, it's telling us, it's prescribing it, and it's also giving us like fences, boundaries that help us, that help guide us to understand in each situation what's that time. Same time, a wedding. We celebrate the wedding for 7 days. What's celebrating too much? What's celebrating too little? How are we supposed to celebrate? This is what God said. This is its time. Anyone else? Any other thoughts on these verses? Very powerful words. Well, hopefully what you heard resonated, and maybe you didn't think on your own what Vega said or Rachel said or Chava said, and then Chava said. So we got 2 from her. So we got 4 different ways we could look at these verses, and they all make so much sense. And hopefully everyone found something that resonates inside of them, like, oh yeah, that's a really true thought. That's a really powerful thought. That's really a way that will help me live in a way more positive in the darkest times, or more feeling the comfort of those walls, or more feeling God's presence in all, because those are sort of overarching themes we can see in all of these ideas. So that was the first 8 verses of chapter 3. Chapter 4 is verse 3. He's focusing on oppression. He's focusing on how people oppress each other, which is like sometimes the harshest thing in the world. Almost like if it's from a natural cause, like hand of God, a weather, natural disaster, it doesn't feel the same as when one person inflicts pain on another. So in chapter 3, we're talking about times when one person inflicts pain on another, and the oppression, and how bad that feels, and how he says, maybe it's the dead are better off than the living. And then he says, verse 3, but better than either of them, meaning either the dead or the living, is he who has not yet been born and has never witnessed the evil that is committed beneath the sun. So again, what King Solomon, what Koheles is saying here is that the dead that don't have to be hurt by these social injustices, they're more fortunate than the living that are being hurt. But the unborn are even more fortunate because they weren't even exposed to these ideas. Now, of course, there are many, many, many levels that we can take from this. On the very simple level, yes, it's talking about people hurting people and how much that hurts, how painful that is. It could also be talking on a very different level about the dead, could actually be a reference to the very righteous, which is interesting because we say the very righteous, even in their death, are always alive. So why would the dead be the very righteous? But it could mean people who have removed themselves when they're alive, when they're in this world. They've removed themselves from all those other things that we define as life. They've separated themselves, and therefore they're always alive. When they're in this world, they're alive. After this world, they're alive, because their whole reality is soul, is spirit, is service of God. And that always continues, and that's not limited by the details that we call life or death. Or it can be a contrast. The living versus the dead could be like the patriarchs versus Moses. Moses, at the point Moses was alive and the patriarchs were dead, and the Jews had sinned, and Moses is begging God to forgive them, and God says, nothing doing. And then when he evokes the merit of the patriarchs, God says, okay, and their merit. Or sort of a similar parallel situation, when King Solomon built the temple, but the fire of God did not descend, the Shekhinah, the divine presence, was not in the temple, and King Solomon is begging and begging God, nothing doing. But when he evoked his father, who had already passed away, of course, on one level, King David never passes away. We say about David, King of Israel, lives and exists forever. But on a certain level, had already passed away. Okay. For Solomon's merit, no. For David's merit, yes. So for Moses' merit, no. For the patriarchs, yes. For Solomon's merit, no. For David's, yes. But what's talking about? All these are pure, godly, absolute, nullified to God people. Yeah, but once they passed away, they have a certain advantage. So that's on a very different level, the advantage of the deceased over those still living. And as we're saying, on a certain level, the advantage of the souls that never came down to this world. But on a simple level, we could look at this like God understands that sometimes life in this world is really hard. Sometimes it's really hard for myriads of reasons, myriad different colors and flavors in the word hard, but we know sometimes it's hard. And God's aware of that. It's written in Koheles. It's one of the 24 books of Torah, which means God really appreciates what we're doing despite the fact that it's so hard. Despite the fact that there's difficulties, that there's pain, that sometimes there's incredible pain in our life, but we still persevere and we still try to serve God and we still believe in him and we still trust him. And that's very valuable. And again, almost going back to the point Chava said before about appreciating the light that comes from the darkness, appreciating the sweet that comes from the bitter. When God looks sometimes at the challenges we all go through, and then at the good choices we make despite the things we're going through, despite the things that are pulling us down, despite the things that could be distracting us, it's even more appreciated by God. It's even sweeter because it's coming sometimes from very, very, very hard challenges. Now, of course, who are we to know? But sometimes you do something and you feel like, I think God really appreciated that. I think God knew that was hard. That was challenging. I didn't want to do it, but I did it for him. And I think God really appreciated that. Anyone who can remember a time when they had that experience, you can share, or you could just raise your virtual hand. A time when you did something, whatever it was, it could be myriads of different things that you just felt, yeah, I think God really appreciated that. And usually, and I'm saying this generally because I don't know if everyone's going to share, but I'm sure if everyone did share, the overarching theme would be, we feel God really appreciated it because it was difficult, because it was hard for us. Now, again, difficult could be the extraneous circumstances, the stuff going on around, and despite all that stuff, I still served God. Difficult could be, for me, it's hard. You know, no one else could find this hard, but for me, it was really hard, but I pushed and did the right thing instead of what I wanted to do. And I think God really appreciated that effort. But for whatever the window dressing around it, I'm sure for most of us, when we're thinking of those times we really feel God appreciated, it probably is colored by things that for whatever reason were difficult. So I will definitely raise my virtual hand because I can think of a number. Got a few up. Anyone else can think in their own life? Okay, I see a real hand. Thank you, Bella. So nice to see a face and not a black screen. Anyone else can think of times when they've done something and they were like, yeah, I think God really appreciated that. You know, it's even a saying of our sages. Our sages say, it's a short 3-word Aramaic, words I don't expect people to really understand, but I'll say it anyway. Lefum sa'ara agra, which means according to the pain is the reward. Now, what are we saying? According to the pain is the reward. If you're doing something good, there's a reward. And if it's a bigger good, there's a bigger reward. Why are sages saying according to the pain is the reward? But what they mean by that is according to the difficulty, according to how difficult it is. And what's super difficult for one person could be very simple for someone else. And what's very challenging could be very obvious. And what one person views as a very difficult situation, someone else says, I go through this all the time, it doesn't even bother me anymore. But for each person, there's always the concept of their pain, what's difficult for them, and therefore their reward, how God so appreciates it. And again, it's very personalized. For each one of us, it could mean something very, very, very different. All right. So thank you for that volunteering. Putting down your hands. Oh, wow. All right. Let's jump now to chapter 5 verse 8. Okay, we're going to go to chapter 5, verse 8. So notice we are moving along because there's 12 chapters, just giving you little tidbits of thought. And honestly, there's so many amazing verses I'm skipping. It's like so hard to prepare this because I'm like, maybe I should do this one. No, maybe I should do this one. No, maybe I should do this one. Like, in the candy store, which do you choose? So hopefully God is directing me to choose what someone here needs to hear. And the rest of us are just piggybacking on that someone. All right. So chapter 5, verse 8. Now, this verse is not like the verses I've said before that are just so obviously telling us such strong messages. The reason I chose it actually is because it's a verse that is very, very often quoted in Hasidic and Kabbalistic works. So just to give you another dimension, now I'm not going to go into all the heavy duty Kabbalah and Hasidus, just a little touch for you to understand the layers and layers of meaning embedded in everything here. Of course, I'm not going to tell you the layers of meaning. We're just going to give a little glimmer. So the verse says, whatever interesting sounding words, the advantage of land is supreme. Even a king is indebted to the soil. Now, there's definitely simple ways of understanding this verse and bringing out the advantage of agriculture, as some explain it, and bringing out how the dependency on food, the dependency on natural resources, or again, the transience of man, the earth lasts forever, while man is very transient, and all of those are themes, and all of those are explored. But in a more Kabbalistic, Hasidic light, what this is really focusing on, and again, in very deep ways, but I'm not going to go into it, is the advantage of earth, the land, which again, you could say is the advantage of food, or the advantage of being a farmer over other professions, or the advantage of putting your money into food, and having money without food isn't going to be very beneficial. And all of those things are also true. But on a deeper level, the earth symbolizes that which seems so low. I mean, it's what everyone steps on. It's on the bottom of whatever the ladder is. It's always on the bottom, rock bottom is the land itself. So it seems the lowest on any totem. But the earth has enormous powers deeper than anything else in all of creation, as we see, because everything else in creation can produce maximum itself. Monkeys can make more monkeys, and men can make more men, and even you can make many of yourself, like fish make schools and schools of fish, but they're still just making themselves. But the earth can produce all vegetation. God implanted in the earth a power of growth, a power of life, and that power is more powerful in the earth than in anywhere else in all of our physical reality. And that's why specifically from the earth, we keep on eliciting that power of life. So if you put in tomato seeds, well, out will come tomatoes in its likeness, or a watermelon, or an apple tree. But they're all pulling on the power of life God embedded in the earth. So here we have this very interesting duality of, on one hand, it's what everyone's stepping on. I mean, even if you don't want to step on something, you're still stepping on it because it's on the ground. And on the other hand, it has a deeper connection to life than anything else. That could resonate on a lot of levels. That could be symbolic on a lot of levels. Just like Kabbalistically, earth, the color of the earth, the brown, is really because if you would take all colors and just like scribble them all, eventually it all become this mush of like browns. So again, it implies all of these energies that have just coalesced into the earth. So it really expresses that there's a lot of stuff in our world like that. There's a lot of stuff in our world that looks like on the bottom, but really it's very powerful. And it's almost like specifically what's going to be on the bottom is going to be more powerful. Like traditionally women versus men. That women were always the ones, unfortunately, not in traditional Jewish thought, but in all the rest of the world, women were always the ones that were pushed on the bottom, and obviously women have far more power than men do. Or spirituality versus physicality. You know, what's real in this world is the physical, and spiritual is sort of ethereal, whatever, a little vague, a little out there. What's more substantial? What's not really? But where's the real power? Or if you want to get very global, the Jewish people versus the rest of the world, right? The Jewish people, we're told, were that one lamb among the 70 wolves. We're that one nation that has suffered more than we can possibly imagine. And on the 9th of Av, that just was this past Thursday, which, as I mentioned before, is the day of all tragedy for the Jewish people. And when you read, there's passages and passages of lamentation. If you're reading them straight, it takes over 3 hours. And as I was reading them, one of the many things I came away with was a sense of, how are there Jews in the world today? How are there 15 million of us still alive after everything our people have gone through? So here we are. That's how the Jewish people have experienced life. And yet we're the power of the world. We're the reason for the world's whole existence. And there's so many layers and layers. You could see this parallel theme of what seems on top, what seems on bottom, and what's really significant. Is it what's on top, or is it what's on bottom? So if we would think of the core of it all, which is, let's call it spiritual versus physical. Others might call it good versus evil. Well, we'll just call it physical and spiritual. When did you have that realization? Did something happen to somebody here that they could share when they really got it? That what's really real, what's really significant is the spiritual reality, even though the rest of the world might view that as like, whatever, not really so there, not really so important, like, whatever, a little fringe issue. When did you have a realization? Someone have a time that they went through something and it made them realize, no, that's the reality. Well, I guess nobody here had that epiphany thought because you would have shared it. So was it a gradual process? Was it a sense of, oh, I always knew that was more important? Or no, was something gradually happened and that made you come to a point of at some point saying, a little step, a little step, a little step, and then you're like, no, that is more important. That is what should be on top, even though in the world, it looks like on the bottom. This is the famous story of Onkelos. I think I might have mentioned recently in this class. Onkelos, who was one of the greatest of the sages, and he actually translated and gave commentary, subtle commentary on all of Torah. And in almost any chumash you'll ever have, there's his commentary, there's his translation, like his version of the linear. Of course, he translated into Aramaic, so for most of us, that would not be very helpful linear. But when he wrote it, that was the language that people spoke. So Onkelos was a convert. He was actually the nephew of the Caesar of Rome. And at that time already, some Romans, some more thoughtful Romans, were becoming aware of this Jewish faith that was so different than the paganism around them. And some of them were starting to get interested in it, which was like sort of a capital offense. And when Onkelos, the nephew of the Caesar, when he realized this is what he wanted, he knew he could not do this staying in Rome. He had to make a getaway. And to leave, he said to his uncle, he wants to go out in the world. He wants to not just sit in the palace and be this worthless prince. He wants to experience life. He wants to become like a merchant and make money. His uncle said, that's great. That's beautiful. And Uncle said, do you have any business advice for me? And his uncle said, yeah, find something that people don't appreciate, that people don't value its worth, so you can get it cheap. And then when everyone realizes how valuable it is, you'll sell it for a lot of profit. Uncle said, great idea. And he went off and he converted to Judaism. And it's recounted in the Talmud how his uncle was so furious and obviously wanted to kill him, and sent 3 different legions of soldiers to get him. And each one, Onkelos, whatever, long story, I'm not going to go into all the details, how each one, Onkelos, persuaded by his saintliness and righteousness, instead of killing him or bringing him back to Rome, they should actually convert and become Jews themselves. After these 3 groups of soldiers didn't do it, his uncle gave up, and Onkelos at a certain point felt safe enough to go back to the palace to confront his uncle. And when he came back, his uncle said to him, what'd you do? And he said, I listened to your advice. You said, look for what's not appreciated. Look for what you could get cheap. And later its value will be recognized. And that's Judaism. Now it's accessible to all. Anyone can convert. But there'll come a time when everyone will realize its worth. And that's really the overarching theme. And I think for all of us, it's a journey we go throughout our life. meaning we all can get entangled in, and this is of course throughout Koheles, throughout this work, we keep coming back to this idea. We can all get entangled in the important nothingness of this world and the stressful nothingness of this world and how this takes you over and then whatever it is, money, pressures, things. And what's really valuable sometimes gets lost in the shuffle. So the earth, that which is stepped on, the earth, that which contains the greatest power of life, service of God, spirituality, goodness, kindness, whatever you want to say is the metaphor for that. That's what seemingly is on the bottom, but really contains the greatest powers. So does anyone remember a time when they realized that? When it struck them, when something happened to them, or just they had that awareness that, yeah, this is where it's at and this is what I should prioritize, even though the rest of the world prioritizes a lot of other things?
I think for me it was a gradual process. I remember that I realized the emptiness. I remember that very well. My career was great. I was making good money. Felt like I have everything, financial, I guess, felt comfortable. And I don't know. And I felt emptiness. I don't even know how, just felt emptiness. And one of my acquaintances told me about the lecture of some rabbi giving a lecture, whatever, on Sunday. And I went to that lecture and I started listening. And I was amazed how intellectually I connected with it. And like on some subconscious level, there were questions and answers. And I'm like, oh, I remember I had the question before, but there was no answer. And for me, it started intellectually, and that's what was I was drawn to that, and it just made sense. What was attracted to me, that's all of this made sense. And then when I guess I made a connection, if this made sense, then the other things that don't make sense, but they're part of the same Torah, then I just don't make sense to me, but they should be also true. And that's, I guess, but it was like a gradual, and it was very difficult to give up things. And it's still some things difficult for me to give up.
Chava said, I think is a really good point. Maybe she made it more real for us to understand. She spoke about the emptiness, and that's having everything and then it feeling empty. And then when it feels empty, that's when you realize that what's on top and what's on bottom, and what's important and what's not important, and what's significant and what's not significant. And Chava shared with us her personal journey and that very, very, very hard movement from doing things that really deeply make sense and then nullifying yourself and saying, I've got to embrace everything. Because ultimately, service of God isn't about the limits of my understanding. And that's, of course, a very, very big movement for anyone. That's a very, very deep, hard movement, especially if you came because it resonated in your mind. To then accept something bigger than your mind, it's really hard. But I think for everyone, there's that point of but this doesn't make any sense. And I so appreciate that makes sense. Well, it's all God. And obviously God's bigger than our minds. God's bigger than what makes sense to us. But Chava really expressed it very beautifully. Anyone else? And again, it's hard sometimes to exactly pinpoint, but we all have that moment when your priorities shift. Because we all start off, no matter, and I was born religious, but we all start off, with this world being very real and very significant. I guess for myself, the most epiphany moment that I can remember, of course I can't pinpoint the moment, but the time for me was when I started learning Hasidic thought. Even though I was born religious and I was born into a Chabad family, I was born into a Lubavitch family, but I wasn't learning Hasidic works until I went off to seminary. That's post high school. So I'm pretty young. Of course, now it seems quite young. What we call first year college, a freshman in college, right after high school. And then I started learning Hasidic texts for real, deeply, inside. And then I felt like a tremendous light going off inside of me, like an enormous switch of light, like, wow. And I think I really did feel very strongly how real it is, the reality of God, the reality of our soul, the reality of serving Him, how it's so real and so alive and so much passion in it that everything else just becomes not as important. That's hard again. It's not giving a pinpoint, but it was definitely that general time where I saw that inner shift in myself. Someone else has a time when they could see that movement where what became real is the spiritual.
I would say most Russian Jews, we were brought up of education was very important for us. We always grew up admiring, and I still do admire people who are getting higher education, and it's I admire people. But it became more important for me, for my son to get Hebrew education. I would love him to go to yeshiva. It shifted for me. So I would definitely say that secular education became less important for me, and yeshiva became more important for me. I ran into someone, very good people, and the person was confiding to me saying, my son is scheduled to go to university, but I'm afraid he's changing his mind, and I think he wants to go to yeshiva before going to university. And this person was nervous about it. And I said to him, I wish it would happen to me, to my son. I said, I would be so happy. So that's a shift.
Sure. That's a very clear demarcation that this is a priority. No, this is a priority. And again, as you're saying, if it's such a strong held belief, if it's such a value system that was so inculcated, because obviously for the Jews in Russia, as for the Jews everywhere in the world, Jews are people of the book and smart people and good students, and our religion trains us to be good students. And many Jews saw it as the way out of oppression, as, the road to getting out of financial oppression, or in other areas, other oppression, the road of being accepted by the world and acceptable to the world. So definitely Jewish people embraced that value and viewed it like this is our ticket. This is our ticket to security. This is our ticket to a good life. This is our ticket to being accepted by the world. So it was very deeply inculcated for a number of generations. And then to say, you know what, something shifted because now I value a Jewish education more. That's clear. That's very strong. Anyone else? Sometimes it's hard to see it in yourself, but it's good to reflect. If you can find that sense of like, used to be like this, like Rivka's saying, now it's like this, or like Chava's saying, when you have it all, and then you're a little too young for midlife crisis, but it just feels empty. What's going on? What is real? Anyone else?
For me, probably it was number of miracles that God performed for myself and my family. And I understand it could be like the outcome could be different. So I understood it was miracle that God performed. So He wanted more from me. And I started, I don't remember if I started classes first or the miracle, big miracle happened. No, I was going to
I remember.
Yeah,
I remember.
Going to
You were
class.
going to class sporadically, and then you had a very big miracle, and you started going to class very consistently.
Yes, yeah. And I took like more active steps towards Judaism and observation. So it's still baby steps, but also it's great. It's gradual. And the more you do, the more you see God's hand in your life and your kids' life. So, and finally you realize that everything is God.
And then when you realize everything is God, it helps you take more steps.
Exactly.
If it's all
Yes.
him, then I'm here to serve him. I'm here to fulfill the reason why God gave me life, why I'm in this world. But that's very interesting what Menucha is saying. Going back to what Menucha said was her movement, because she could identify it. Like, so Chava said the movement came from seeing emptiness when you have everything. And Menucha saying a different, also classical road, but seeing the miracles of God, and that making you realize that what's real is God, which means what's real is spirituality. And this world is not so real, because if God's real, then this world isn't as real. And I have to give Menucha a lot of credit because some people could go through the same things Menucha went through and just not acknowledge that it was a miracle. You know, we can all go through miracles and credit it to luck, random, nature, happenstance, whatever. Move on. So to recognize it as a miracle when you're not trained to think along those lines, when you haven't developed that muscle through years and years of looking at the world and seeing the hand of God, is very big. But then more than that, because of course sometimes we go through very big miracles, like I do remember the one that I think Menucha is referring to, and it was very big. But then people, even when they realize the miracle and they're grateful for the miracle, after a while they just move on. And they don't make life changes because of it. Which means they had that like sort of awareness that it's all God and God is real and God created this miracle. But then they keep going. And they don't do anything because of that. So that also takes a certain something that you're connecting to that enough to say, no. If this is real, I've got to do something because of it. I've got to make different choices because of it. I know someone I was very close to, a woman not at all religious, and when she had a lot of very intense colon issues for a while, so she had a very hard time eating anything. And she told me, and she recognized it enough, and she was willing to share it with me as her religious friend, that for some strange reason, the only thing her body could digest was kosher. It didn't make any sense. But if it was kosher, her body could digest it. But if it wasn't kosher, the same food item, if there was a kosher symbol on it, her body digested it. If there wasn't a kosher symbol on it, her body could not digest it. That's a pretty real hand of God. And she saw it. She saw it enough to share it with me. But then she just moved on. She didn't change her life because of it. So sometimes I think like Chava's road, a lot of people can bring people to this sense of like, wait, what's real? And sometimes, like Menucha's saying, it could bring people to say what's real, but it doesn't mean that everyone who has miracles says that, or even if they say that, walks the path and makes changes because of it. So Menucha, I think God appreciates every one of your baby steps, and they're probably not such baby steps anymore. And every single thing, like we were saying before, how difficult it is for us, it just means God even more appreciates and values what we're doing. Anyone else can think, because I think it's so illuminating to hear when people can find that and identify it in themselves. Okay, well, maybe it's something people can reflect on privately with themselves. What gave them this awareness of what's real is what's on the bottom? What's real is, again, whatever you're calling on the bottom, God, spirituality, virtue, goodness. That's what's real. That's what you want to hold on to. Thank you.